My father-in-law stood up at Christmas dinner and told 14 relatives I had never contributed a single thing to his family. He did not know that I had spent 18 months quietly holding the one secret that could end his marriage. He did not know I had already called a solicitor. He did not know I was done. He found out that evening. The smell of roasted lamb and clove-spiced wine should not be the thing you associate with the moment your life permanently split in two. But for me, it is. It was December 23rd, 2023. 14 people around a table in a house in Hertfordshire that had been in the Adeyemi family for 31 years. The candles were ivory. The centerpiece was fresh eucalyptus. There was a bottle of Bordeaux that probably cost more than my first car. And Gerald Adeyemi, my father-in-law, patriarch, property developer, the man who had never once called me by my first name in 4 years of marriage, stood up from his chair, raised that glass, and smiled. He looked around the room. He let the silence settle the way men like him always do, like they're doing you a favor by speaking. And then he told everyone at that table that I had never contributed a single meaningful thing to his family. 14 people. Complete silence. My husband didn't move. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I looked down the table at his wife, at Vivian, and I said, very quietly, Vivian, would you mind showing everyone your phone? Specifically the folder you asked me to keep private. The one you created in February. She stood up so fast her chair scraped the hardwood floor. That sound. I still hear it. And that was only the beginning. My name is Danielle Osei-Mensah. I was 34 years old that December, and I had been married to Marcus Adeyemi for 4 years. On paper, I was a financial compliance analyst at a mid-sized private equity firm in the City of London. In practice, that meant I spent my days reading the fine print that other people didn't want to read, flagging irregularities, tracing paper trails, understanding exactly how money moved and where it tried to hide. I was good at it. I had been good at it since I was 26. It was not glamorous work. It was precise work. And precision, as it turns out, is a very particular kind of power. Marcus was the eldest son of Gerald and Vivian Adeyemi, a family that had built their identity around Lagos connections, London property, and the very specific brand of respectability that comes from owning things other people can only rent. Gerald had a development portfolio worth somewhere north of £4.2 million. There were 2 commercial properties in Croydon, a residential block in Luton, and a family trust that Marcus was legally named in, a trust one had co-signed as his financial representative when we were still newly married, and I still believed that being invited to sign something meant you were being let in. It did not mean that. What it meant I would only fully understand 18 months later, standing in a hallway I wasn't supposed to be standing in, hearing something I was never supposed to hear. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What you need to understand first is this. The disrespect did not begin at that dinner table. It had been running quietly for 4 years. Like a leak inside a wall. Invisible until the ceiling came down. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Not invisible in the dramatic sense. Not screamed at, not locked out, not visibly mistreated. Invisible in the quieter, more surgical way, where you are present at every table, included in every invitation, and still somehow consistently erased. Where the message is never spoken aloud but arrives perfectly clearly, every single time. That was my 4 years with the Adeyemis. It started with the wedding. Marcus and I had been engaged for 7 months when we began planning the ceremony. I had sourced every vendor myself, the florist in Islington, the caterer from a Nigerian-owned restaurant group in Peckham that did the most extraordinary jollof I had ever tasted, the photographer, the cake designer, the venue in Surrey that had a waiting list and that I had gotten us onto through a contact I'd spent 2 weeks cultivating. I had spreadsheets. I had contracts. I had timelines. Over the following 3 months, Vivian quietly replaced every single one of them. Not confrontationally. That was never her style. The florist had a scheduling conflict. The caterer wasn't quite what they had in mind for the family. The photographer was swapped for someone Gerald played golf with. Each substitution came with a smile and a reasonable explanation. By the time I realized what had happened, I was standing at my own wedding surrounded by every choice Vivian had made, with credit given to no one, least of all me. Marcus said I was being sensitive. I filed that away. The second incident was 14 months into the marriage. Gerald was finalizing a commercial property acquisition in Croydon, a £1.1 million deal involving a mixed-use building he intended to convert into residential units. He needed a compliance review done before exchange. Marcus mentioned casually that I did exactly that kind of work for a living. Gerald agreed to let me look at the documents. I spent 11 days on that review. I found 2 regulatory discrepancies that would have delayed the acquisition by at least 4 months and potentially exposed Gerald to a £40,000 penalty from the local planning authority. I corrected both. The deal went through cleanly. At the completion dinner, Gerald introduced me to a solicitor as Marcus's wife. Not by name, not by role, not with any acknowledgement of what I had just saved him. Marcus said his father was old-fashioned. I filed that away too. The third incident was the one that should have told me everything. It was a Sunday evening in March of 2022. I was coming down the hallway outside the sitting room at the Hertfordshire house when I heard Gerald's voice, low and deliberate, the way he spoke when he believed he wasn't being overheard. He was talking to Marcus. He said, and I remember this with perfect clarity because I stood very still against that wall for a long time afterward. He said, Danielle is a smart enough girl, but she has no family name worth protecting. You need to remember what this family is building and who it is being built for. Marcus said nothing. I stood in that hallway for another 30 seconds. Then I walked back to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and said nothing at all. I had learned by then that the Adeyemi family communicated in silences as much as in words. That what was never addressed became what was permanently accepted. What they didn't know was that I had also learned professionally, rigorously over a decade of compliance work that patterns leave traces. That every system, no matter how polished its surface, eventually shows you where the pressure is coming from. I was being patient. I had no idea yet that Vivian was also keeping a secret that would change everything. That was still 6 months away. Christmas in the Adeyemi house was not a casual affair. Vivian spent 6 weeks preparing for it. The table was set with imported linen. There were place cards written in calligraphy. The lamb had been ordered from a specific butcher in Berkhamsted that Gerald had used for 20 years. Family came from London, from Birmingham, from Lagos. Aunts, cousins, Gerald's business partner and his wife, Marcus's younger brother Kofi and his girlfriend. 14 people total, seated in a room that smelled of eucalyptus and expensive candles, with a bottle of 2018 Chateau Pichon Baron open at the head of a table. I had driven 2 hours to be there. I had brought a gift for every person in that room. I was wearing a dress I had bought specifically for that evening. Dinner had been going for about 40 minutes when Gerald stood up. He did it the way he always did, unhurried, deliberate, like a man who had never once in his life questioned whether the room wanted to hear from him. He picked up his glass. He smiled. People quieted. He began with the family. How proud he was. How far they had all come. How the Adeyemi name meant something in this country now, in a way it hadn't when he arrived with £300 in his pocket and a contact number for a man in Peckham who owed his father a favor. It was a good speech, honestly. He was a compelling man. I will give him that. And then he turned to Marcus. He talked about Marcus's future. The expansion of the property portfolio. The next acquisition. The legacy being built. And then, with the particular casualness of someone who has rehearsed a cruelty until it sounds like an observation, he said, a man needs a partner who contributes to that vision, who understands what is being built and adds to it, not someone who simply enjoys the comfort of what others have worked for. He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't need to. Every person at that table understood exactly who he meant. I felt Marcus go still beside me. I watched Kofi look at his plate. I watched Gerald's business partner take a slow sip of wine. And I watched Vivian, poised, composed Vivian, sit with her hands folded in her lap, looking at the centerpiece, saying absolutely nothing in my defense. That was the moment something in me went very quiet. Not the quiet of defeat. The other kind. I had co-signed documents for this family. I had saved a £1.1 million acquisition. I had kept a secret for 18 months that, if it had ever left my mouth, would have detonated every carefully constructed surface of this room. I had kept it because Vivian had asked me to, because I had given my word, because I believed in some part of myself I am no longer particularly proud of, that loyalty to this family would eventually be returned. Gerald set his glass down and sat back in his chair, satisfied. And I made a decision. I picked up my own glass. I set it down. I looked down the length of that table at Vivian, who was still studying the eucalyptus centerpiece like it contained the answers to questions she hadn't asked yet. And I said, clearly enough for all 14 people to hear, "Vivian, would you mind showing everyone your phone? Specifically the folder you asked me to keep private. The one you created in February." The room went absolutely still. Vivian looked up. And for the first time in 4 years, I watched the composure leave her face completely. She stood up so fast her chair legs dragged across the hardwood. Gerald frowned. "What folder?" he said. "Vivian, what is she talking about?" But Vivian wasn't looking at Gerald.
She was looking at me.
And I held her gaze and said nothing else at all. Because the point was never to explain it at the dinner table. The point was to make sure everyone in that room knew that I had something. And that I had chosen until that exact moment to stay quiet. That should have been the end of the evening. It wasn't. What came next took another 3 weeks, 2 solicitor calls, 1 very uncomfortable conversation in a Hertfordshire kitchen, and a property trust audit that nobody at that table had seen coming. Let me take you back 18 months. It was a Saturday in June of 2022. Marcus and I had driven up to the Hertfordshire house for what Vivian had described as a quiet weekend, which, in Adeyemi language, meant 20 people arriving by Sunday afternoon and Gerald holding court at the kitchen island from 10 in the morning. I had come down early that Saturday. The house was still mostly quiet. I was looking for the utility room. We had stayed in the East Wing guest room, and I had never learned that part of the house properly when I opened the wrong door. It was a small room, a study of sorts, or something that had once been one. A writing desk, a lamp that was on, and Vivian, who I had been told was still asleep, sitting with her back to the door, holding a phone I had never seen before. Not her usual phone. Not the rose gold one she carried everywhere, the one she used to photograph table settings and send voice notes to her sisters. This was a plain black handset, older, the kind you buy specifically because it does very little. She heard me. She turned. And in the half-second before her expression reset into something composed and gracious, I saw something I had never seen on Vivian Adeyemi's face before.
Fear.
She recovered immediately, laughed it off, said she was dealing with a private matter for a friend, asked me not to mention to Gerald that she was up so early, as he'd worry. Normal words, normal tone, the whole performance seamless. But she held that phone against her chest the entire time she spoke to me. I apologized for the interruption and left. I thought about it for 3 days. I told myself it was none of my business. Then, 5 weeks later, Vivian called me.
Not a family call.
Not a group WhatsApp. A direct call, on a Tuesday afternoon, to my personal number. She asked if we could meet. Alone. I drove to a cafe in Marylebone that she chose, and she was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with her coat still on. She slid a piece of paper across the table. On it was a cloud storage link and a password. She said she needed someone she could trust to hold something for her. Something private. She didn't explain what it was. She said only that she needed to know it was safe, and that she needed it to be someone outside the immediate family, someone who understood discretion. She looked at me across that table and said, "You're the only person in this family I trust with something like this." I should have said no.
I know that now.
I knew it if I am honest then. But there is a particular kind of trap that is built entirely out of being treated, for once, like you matter, and she had constructed it perfectly. I took the paper. I accessed the folder that evening. What was inside, it was not complicated. It was, in the language of my profession, a very clean paper trail. There were photographs, taken in hotels, twice in what appeared to be a private apartment. There were bank transfer records, 7 of them, amounts between £800 and £3,400, sent over 14 months to a name I didn't recognize. And there were messages, screenshots of a conversation that made the nature of the relationship entirely clear. Vivian Adeyemi, the composed and socially immaculate wife of Gerald Adeyemi, had been conducting an affair for at least 16 months. And she had, for reasons I spent a long time trying to fully understand, chosen me, the daughter-in-law she had spent for years quietly erasing, to be the only person who knew. I did not confront her. I did not tell Marcus. I did not tell anyone. I downloaded a local copy, encrypted it, and stored it the way I would store any sensitive document in my professional life, carefully, quietly, somewhere only I could access. I had given my word, and for 18 months I kept it, even when she replaced my wedding vendors without acknowledgement. Even when Gerald called me Marcus's wife to his own solicitor. Even when I stood in a hallway and heard myself described as a name not worth protecting. I kept it because I had made a promise. And because some part of me, the part one have since had some very honest conversations with, still believed that keeping faith with people who didn't deserve it said something important about who I was. What I had not fully reckoned with, until Gerald stood up at that dinner table and smiled, was this. There is a version of integrity that protects everyone around you at the cost of yourself. And at some point, that stops being virtue and starts being something closer to self-destruction. Gerald's speech was not the thing that broke the agreement. It was the look on Marcus's face when his father finished, and he said nothing. Not a word. Not a hand on my arm. Nothing. That was the moment I understood, finally and completely, that I had been protecting a family that had never once considered protecting me. The folder was still there. Encrypted. Intact. And for the first time in 18 months, I let myself think about what I was actually holding.
I want to be precise about something.
What happened at that dinner table was not a moment of impulse. It was not grief spilling over, or humiliation finally finding a voice, or a woman pushed too far doing something she would later regret. I have read enough case files, reviewed enough transactions, traced enough paper trails to know the difference between a reaction and a decision. What I did that evening was a decision. And it had not been made at the table. It had been made 48 hours earlier, on the morning of December 21st, sitting at my desk in our flat in Bermondsey, with a cup of tea gone cold beside me and 3 documents open on my screen. Let me explain what I had found. As Marcus's financial co-signatory, I had legitimate access to certain correspondence relating to the Adeyemi Family Property Trust. I had never gone looking for anything that is important to say clearly. But 3 weeks before Christmas, a document had arrived in a shared folder Marcus and I both had access to. A routine trust administration letter, the kind that gets filed and forgotten. I had opened it because opening documents is what I do. And what I found inside it was a discrepancy. Not dramatic. Not obvious. The kind of thing that would mean nothing to someone without my training and everything to someone with it. A beneficiary amendment, dated 14 months earlier, that had been processed without the countersignature it legally required. Marcus's countersignature, which meant that a quiet adjustment had been made to the distribution structure of a trust that Marcus was legally named in, and Marcus had never been informed. I read it 3 times. Then I called a solicitor. Not a family solicitor. A private one. A woman I had worked with professionally on a compliance matter 2 years earlier, sharp and discreet, and entirely unconnected to anyone the Adeyemis knew. I did not tell her everything. I told her enough. She confirmed what I suspected within 24 hours. The amendment, as processed, was legally challengeable. Marcus had grounds to dispute it. The trust was not as settled as Gerald believed it to be. I drafted a letter. I did not send it. I made 1 phone call to the trust administrators, not threatening, not accusatory, simply a professional inquiry about documentation procedures on a named account. Enough to create a record that the question had been asked. Enough to ensure that if anything was going to be quietly buried, there was now a timestamp making that burial more complicated. Then I drove to Hertfordshire. I want you to understand what I brought to that dinner table. Not anger. Not a desire to humiliate anyone, because I am aware of what public humiliation costs and I did not want to spend that currency carelessly. What I brought was information. Specifically, the knowledge that the family Gerald had just announced I contributed nothing to is currently sitting on a legal discrepancy that could unravel 18 months of estate planning and that I was the only person at that table who both knew about it and understood what it meant. I also brought the folder. Not physically. I did not walk into that dining room with anything in my hands except a glass and 4 years of accumulated patience. But I knew it was there. And when Gerald stood up and smiled, and Marcus sat silent beside me, and Vivian studied the centerpiece, I knew exactly what I was going to say. I had not decided to use it until that moment. That part is true. I had spent 48 hours preparing a response and genuinely hoping I would not need it. I had wanted, if I am honest, for Marcus to say something. One sentence. His hand on the table. Anything. He didn't. So I set down my glass, looked at Vivian, and said the only sentence that needed to be said. Not to destroy her. To make clear, to her, to Gerald, to every person sitting in that room, that I had not been silent for 4 years because I had nothing to say. I had been silent because I had chosen to be, and I had just made a different choice. The chair scraping the hardwood floor was the last sound Vivian made for a long time. Gerald was the one who spoke first. He set his glass down with the particular deliberateness of a man who has never once in his life allowed a room to move faster than he intended, and he said, very quietly, "Vivian,
Sit down."
and someone tell me what folder we are talking about." No one at that table said anything. Vivian did not sit down. She looked at me for a long moment, and I want to be careful here because I have thought about that look many times in the months since, and I do not think it was hatred. I think it was something more complicated than that. I think it was the look of a woman who had made a calculated decision about who she could safely use and had discovered, at the worst possible moment, that she had miscalculated. She left the room. Gerald followed. The door to his study closed. The 14 people remaining at that table did not speak for what felt like a very long time. Kofi poured himself more wine. Someone's aunt asked, in a careful voice, whether anyone wanted more lamb. Marcus turned to me. He said, "What did you do?" Not, "What did my father just say to you?" Not, "Are you all right?" "What did you do?" I looked at him for a moment. Then I folded my napkin, placed it on the table, and went upstairs to pack a bag. What followed did not happen quickly. I want to resist the temptation to compress it into something cleaner than it was. Gerald demanded to see the folder. Not that evening. That evening ended with Vivian in their bedroom and Gerald drinking alone in his study, and the family dispersing with the careful efficiency of people who have decided not to know what they just witnessed. But 4 days later, in a phone call to Marcus that I was not part of, Gerald demanded to know what his daughter-in-law was holding and why. Marcus, to his credit, and I measure his credit carefully, told him it was not his to demand. It was the first time in 4 years I had heard of Marcus drawing a line with his father about anything concerning me. I noted it. I did not mistake it for the thing I had actually needed, which was for that line to have been drawn at a dinner table in front of 14 people before I had to draw it myself. The folder surfaced 3 weeks later. Not through me. Vivian told Gerald herself. I believe because she understood, by then, that the alternative was worse. What followed between them is not my story to tell. What I will say is that it was not clean, and it was not quick, and the version of the Adeyemi marriage that emerged from it was a different structure entirely. The trust amendment was challenged. The solicitor I had contacted filed the formal dispute in January. It took 4 months to resolve. Marcus received what he had always been legally entitled to, no more, no less, and Gerald did not speak to me directly for the duration of that process. When he finally did, it was in the kitchen of the Hertfordshire house on a Tuesday afternoon in April. Marcus was in the garden. It was just the two of us. Gerald said, "I underestimated you." He said it the way men like him apologize, not as a concession but as a form of revised respect. An acknowledgement that the category he had placed me in was wrong, not that the placing had been cruel. It was not enough. It was also, I recognized, probably everything he was capable of. I said, "I know you did." And I put the kettle on. Marcus and I are separated now. I want to say that plainly, without drama, because it deserves plainness. We are not divorced. We are in that particular in-between space that people occupy when they have not yet decided whether what remains is worth the work of rebuilding it. Some days I think it is. Some days I sit in my flat in Bermondsey with a cup of tea, and I think about a man who stayed silent at a dinner table when I needed him to speak, and I understand that some silences change the shape of a room permanently. I do not hate him. I am not sure I have ever hated anyone in this story, which is something I have had to sit with, because hatred would be simpler. What I have instead is clarity. I know what I am worth professionally, legally, financially, with a precision that 4 years inside that family actually sharpened rather than diminished. I know what I will absorb and what I will not. I know the difference between loyalty and self-erasure, and I know which one I was practicing for far too long. I kept Vivian's secret for 18 months because I gave my word and I believed that meant something.
I still believe it meant something.
I am simply no longer willing to pay for that belief with my own dignity. The folder is deleted now. Both copies. I deleted them the day after the trust dispute was resolved because I had never intended to use them as a weapon and I did not want to become the kind of person who keeps weapons she no longer needs. I drove out of Hertfordshire for the last time on a Wednesday morning in May. The hedgerows were doing what English hedgerows do in May, which is to say they were unreasonably green and entirely indifferent to the ending of anything. I had one bag in the boot. I had a call scheduled with my solicitor at noon. I had a flat waiting for me that was quiet in exactly the way I needed it to be quiet, not empty, but mine. I did not look back at the house as I pulled out of the drive. Not because I wasn't tempted, but because I had spent 4 years looking at that family and waiting to be seen. I was done waiting. The road was clear. The morning was cold and very bright. I drove. Here is the expanded version. She didn't burn anything down. She didn't scream. She didn't threaten. She didn't perform her pain for a room full of people who had already decided who she was. She simply stopped protecting people who had never once protected her. That is the part one want you to sit with. Not the folder. Not the solicitor. Not the trust audit or the chair scraping the hardwood floor or the look on Vivian's face when she realized the woman she had spent 4 years quietly erasing had been holding her most dangerous secret with both hands, carefully, faithfully for 18 months.
Not any of that.
The part one want you to sit with is this. Danielle did not do anything wrong. She showed up. She signed the documents. She saved the deal. She kept the secret. She drove 2 hours to a Christmas dinner and brought a gift for every single person in that room. She did everything that was asked of her, and several things that were never asked because that is the kind of woman she was. And she was still the one who had to fight for her own dignity at a table she had earned a seat at. That is not an unusual story.
I think you know that.
I think that is exactly why you are still here, at the end of 7 chapters, feeling something you might not have a clean word for yet. There is a version of this that happens in boardrooms, in family group chats, in performance reviews where the feedback is soft and the outcome is already decided, in kitchens, in hallways, in the passenger seat of a car on the way home from something that just happened and that no one will ever fully acknowledge happened. It happens to women who are overqualified and undercredited, to women who keep the peace at the cost of keeping themselves, to women who are told, in 100 quiet ways, that their presence is tolerated but their power is not. Danielle's story ended with a drive down a clear road on a cold, bright morning in May. One bag, one call scheduled, a flat that was finally, entirely hers. Not a victory lap, not a revenge fantasy. Just a woman who had finally, after 4 years, chosen herself and was learning what it felt like to not apologize for it. If this story found you at the right moment, if something in these 7 chapters sat down next to something you have been carrying, follow for what comes next. And share it with someone who needs to hear that patience in the right hands is not weakness. That silence is not the same as having nothing to say. That the most dangerous person in any room is often the one who has chosen, until this exact moment, to stay quiet. It never was weakness. It never was.